Thank you, Stephanie. And before we begin, I just want to say thanks so much to Stephanie and her team for making this panel possible, and also for the artists for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure learning about your work. So I'm going to just jump right in with the first question. It's a two-part question. So in learning about your work, I noticed that the body is a rather charged site in your practice, and I'm curious to know, what is your relationship to the body, both as a discursive framework or concept, and as a corporeal, sensorial, material vessel or medium through which you live and breathe? And the second part is, how does your understanding of the body inform your practice? And I think maybe, Lulu, if you want to get us started, since your work seems to be very much hinged on the body.
各位好，我係需要講廣東話嘅，咁咧我分享下啦，我都好中意用身體去做一個素材去畫嘅，咁因為咧我覺得我用咗一個咁耐嘅身體啦，我覺得我好似對佢嘅了解咧，其實都唔夠深啦。佢有陣時咧就好似會有一啲我意想唔到嘅身體反應啦，佢又會好似我嘅即係我嘅思想同埋我嘅行動有陣時好似唔係好一致啦。咁我覺得好似好神秘咁樣咯。咁我亦都好即係我自己又發覺咧，其實我諗情緒咧對於身體咧亦都有好大嘅一個好關鍵嘅影響嘅。咁有啲好強烈嘅情緒咧，好似一啲烙印咁樣咧，好似記憶咗喺身體嘅某一處咁樣咯。當我哋遇到一啲情景，佢會帶動翻嗰啲記憶，令我身體咧就會有一啲我意想不到嘅反應咯。咁我覺得呢啲全部都係啲好有趣嘅經驗咯。咁我就所以我就同埋我覺得呢個都唔係我自己即係雖然係啲好個人嘅經驗啦，但係我覺得好多人都會有相同嘅經驗咯。所以我就會透過我呢啲經驗，然後我用我嘅繪畫就畫翻呢啲感覺出嚟咯，咁樣。
Perhaps, Terrence, do you want to talk about the body?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I just want to talk about my sculptures and my body. I grew up in a family of sculpting. My father is a second-generation sculptor. And in my art, I've got certain disciplines which I feel like I have to express them, like the culture itself, which is Chivano. Chivano is a way how the Zimbabwean people live. They have got a certain traditional thing and the ancestral energy which they use for them to survive in their criteria. And about Chivano, it came from a long line of tribes which was from the Central Africa to down Southern Africa, which is almost 24 countries. They were called the Bantu people, which were the black majorities, which were migrating from the Central Africa down to Southern Africa. So my feeling in Chivano is through the spiritual energy which moves into human body. Sometimes we feel like we have people who lead us in our understanding. Sometimes we use our carnal mind. But I believe there is another energy which lives within us and which follows us, which leaves us with such a decision which we can have. So in my sculptures, I feel like I have to create a certain elements and certain characters which lives before us, which were the ancestral energies and the belief which they were believing and the energy which were being taught by their generation gap. Because most of the things were oral tradition. So we were respecting the elders and we still respect the elders, So information comes through us, so we find the way to create the body and the language that resemble the humanity.
Pauline or Joydeb, do you guys want to chime in? So the question is, in learning about your practice, I noticed that the body is a very charged site. And I'm curious to know, what is your relationship to the body, both as a discursive framework or concept, and also a material, sensorial, corporeal vessel through which you live and breathe? And how does this understanding inform your practice?
মূলত আমি নিজেকে একজন পারফরম্যান্স আর্টিস্ট হিসেবে পরিচয় দিতে ইচ্ছুক, কারণ এই মিডিয়াটাকে আমি খুব ভালোবাসি। এবং যখন মানে বাংলাদেশে যখন আমরা এই শুরু করি এই পারফরম্যান্স আর্টটা, তখন আমরা আসলে জানতাম না এটা পারফরম্যান্স আর্ট। তো আমরা মূলত একটা ওয়ার্কশপ দিয়ে শুরু করেছিলাম নিজেরা যে স্কাল্পচার কীভাবে মুভ করে।
I like to, Joydeb likes to say he's a performance artist, and he likes to work using his body, giving messages. And when he first started doing performance in Bangladesh, that time he didn't realize that performance art was a practice.
তো পরবর্তীতে আমরা যখন ইন্টারনেটের মাধ্যমে জানতে পারলাম যে পারফরম্যান্স আর্টও একটা আর্ট মিডিয়া, তখন আমি মূলত সবসময় আমার মানে বডিটাকে ইউজ করেই মানে পারফরম্যান্স আর্টটা প্র্যাকটিস করার চেষ্টা করছি, কারণ মানে ওখানে মানে খরচ কম, মানে তেমন খরচ নাই।
Over the years, when he learned through the internet that performance art was a way or a type of art practice, he realized that this is the type of performance he chooses, and also because it costs less financially.
আমার মাঝে মাঝে যখন পারফরমেন্স করার জন্য দর্শকদের সামনে আসি, অথবা নিজেই যখন বাসায় প্র্যাকটিস করি, তখন মনে হয় আমার মানে বডিটা, শরীরটা আরেকটা শরীরের সাথে মানে ওইটা অন্য মানে আরেকটা জগতে চলে যায় আসলে। সেটা তখন মানে আমার কাছে মনে হয় ওইটা আরেকটা সত্তা ওখানে তৈরি হয়।
When he practices, when he thinks about a performance, the idea, and when he's actually performance, he feels like an out-of-body experience, that he is experiencing or expressing not through his own body, but he's in a different space.
ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
Hi. So I think of the body as a place or a site that, I guess as I relate it to my work, would be where you can feel things. So in the most practical sense, and I think especially a lot of my work deals with ideas about memory, and so I think of it as how can we experience something that is not able to be seen, and oftentimes you feel it through various modes of your body. So I think that that's the most simple answer. I can keep going.
If you want, or there's a follow-up question that actually leads directly to your idea of memory. So maybe I can ask the second one and you can follow up. Yeah? Okay. All right. So it seems to me that the notion of place, both as a geographical space or a mental space, plays a significant role in all of your work. I'm quite curious, what is your emotional connection to place, and how does it shape the narrative dimension in your work? And so with Pauline, I know that memory is, a psychic space that you work with a lot. So perhaps you can elaborate on, and also thinking about the MRI scans of your own brain, actually.
So I think that the work will eventually loop, but so yeah, in my practice, I work with through a lot of different means. So one of the projects was I was thinking about how can we prove a memory that we're unsure about, and I used MRI scans, the world of science, to try and kind of get at a universal idea of truth. So I thought of past family or personal story memories while I got MRI scans to essentially get a photograph of something I wasn't sure happened or not from growing up. And I then created this large abstract work out of felted wool, which, speaking about the body, is a very physical process to create, and it creates this surface that I think is very related also to the body. It's very luscious, and it kind of begs to be touched. The resulting work, I made it purposely really on a large scale because I wanted it to inhabit the force of a memory on your body. So it was kind of in the semicircle, and it was really, it was like 20 feet. I'm not sure what this is in meters, but 20 feet by 12 feet. And, speaking about this topic of, new bodies and stuff, I was thinking of this kind of image as the body, as like the body as a site of memory. But what happened is that the work looks like a very abstract tapestry, essentially, but it actually holds really specific information, which I thought was like a very nice kind of parallel or metaphor to how memory acts on your experience in life. So, yeah.
Also, Terrence, I was thinking about the place that you're from, Zimbabwe, as a kind of a very charged place from which you work. Perhaps you can also address this question.
Yeah, to my understanding and my knowledge of how I do my things and how I construct my sculptures, there are so many stories which we grew up knowing and which still surviving in Zimbabwe, between Zimbabwe and other countries, between the borders. Like some of the stories, they come through the rivers. Like there is spiritual things which we call the god of the waters, which is like the Nyami Nyami between Zimbabwe and Zambia. These are like some of the elements which comes into my mind when I start to make my sculptures. These are the gods of the waters which protect the people between Zambia and Zimbabwe. Then during the 1950s, the colonizers came and they tried to make a border between Zimbabwe and Zambia. Then the Nyami Nyami gets angry between that time. So there was such a controversial and a demolition and a hazard which happened during that time. So to my sense, I have to feel of making a sculpture which makes and resemble the same things which comes from the earth. And I end up trying to find a way to manipulate my materials using the materiality of things which I found on the earth, the likes of the stone, which is almost the 11th century according to the records of the sculpting methods in Zimbabwe. Then I have to choose the elements like copper, which is a mineral from Zimbabwe. So all these things, like copper is the first mineral which was used for trade during the barter trade in Zimbabwe. They were using elements like copper, ivory, diamond, gold, and exchanging for nothing, which means they were given like a certain cloth, but they were exchanging using. So I have to find a way to resemble those materials into my artwork so they become something solid for the next generation.
Thank you. And then Joydeb, do you want to speak to about place, specifically the Chakma Palace? How does that figure in your work and the narrative dimension?
থ্যাংক ইউ আমার হচ্ছে বেশিরভাগ কাজগুলো মানে আমার সাথে আমার শৈশবের ঘটে যাওয়া ঘটনা সেগুলোকে আমি আবার মানে আঁকার চেষ্টা করি চাকমা রাজবাড়ি যেটা সেটা হচ্ছে আমি আমার দাদির কাছ থেকে শুনছিলাম যে কাপ্তাই বাঁধের কারণে মানে চাকমা রাজার বাড়িটা পানির নিচে ডুবে আছে
Most of my works are from historical stories, stories I've heard from my grandparents, especially about the Chakma Palace. And this Chakma Palace, a lot of these topics come in my work because the Chakma Palace, through a dam that was created and it broke and it flooded our palace.
চাকমা রাজার আমি কখনো ওই চাকমা রাজার বাড়িটা দেখি নাই তবে আমি মানে ওই গ্রামের অনেক বয়স্কদের কাছ থেকে ওখানকার অনেক ঘটনা শুনেছি মানে ওখানে বাঁধ দেওয়ার ফলে অনেক মানুষ মানে অনেক শত শত গ্রাম ডুবে গেছিল তো ওই ঘটনাগুলো আমি যখন শুনছি তখন থেকে নিজে থেকে একটু যাচাই করা শুরু করি মানে আরও কয়েকজনের কাছ থেকে জিজ্ঞেস করি মানে এই জিনিসগুলো তারপরে মানে আস্তে আস্তে আমি আমার ভাবলাম যে আমি আমার কাজের মধ্যে এটা নিয়ে আসি
I heard these stories from my grandparents and other older generation people about the Chakma Palace. I've never seen the palace with my eyes because it was submerged before I was born. But I've heard these stories from many elders and I reconfirmed. And that's how this palace keeps coming back into my work. And one day I want to see it.
হ্যাঁ ওইটা হচ্ছে এখন রাঙামাটির ওই লেকটা পর্যটন এলাকা হিসেবে খুব জনপ্রিয় তো আমার ইচ্ছা হচ্ছে মানে এই রাজবাড়িটা মানে কিভাবে আছে সেটা দেখার খুব আমার ইচ্ছা তো সেই কারণে আমি চিন্তা করছি ওই আমি যেসব গল্পগুলো শুনেছি মানে কাহিনীগুলো শুনছি সেগুলোকে প্রথমে শোনার পরে আমি আমার মতো করে গ্রহণ করে আমি আবার সেটা প্রকাশ করার চেষ্টা করি তো এই আর্ট সিরিজের আর্টওয়ার্কগুলো যখন যদি বিক্রি করতে পারি আমি বিক্রি হয় তাহলে হচ্ছে আমার প্রথম ইচ্ছা হচ্ছে আমি একটা দুপুরের পোশাক কিনবো এবং মানে নিজে প্রথমে ডুবে গিয়ে রাজবাড়িটাকে দেখব এবং এরপরে হয়তো দেখার পরে নতুন কোনো গল্প আমার কাছে তৈরি হবে মানে সেটা আমি আবার আঁকার এবং পারফরমেন্স করার চেষ্টা করব
Since these stories I have heard from my ancestral family, and when the dam broke, the whole area, including the palace, has been submerged. This keeps coming back in my work, and it's now a tourist destination, and a lot of people go there to visit, but it's a place of heartbreak, and so many families have been displaced. So many hundreds and thousands of families have been displaced. But for me, I want to go and see it and with my own eyes. So through my works, and if they sell, I will use that money to buy a diving suit and dive into that area and to see the palace with my own eyes. And once I see it with my own eyes, maybe my works will change, maybe I will draw the palace in a different way.
Thank you. And Lulu, maybe you can speak to perhaps thinking about the psychic space as a place from which that informs your the narrative dimensions of your work.
係我嘅作品咧，就好少會畫場景啦，或者係一個好固定嘅地方，因為我覺得身體就好似本身有個空間咁樣，咁我就會想係以向內觀察為主咯。咁然後我同埋我又覺得好似外在嘅自由咧，我覺得我冇辦法可以控制佢，但係我覺得內在嘅自由，我想掌握多啲咯。咁然後我又好見到情緒啊呢啲，即係情緒咧係會好容易，我會俾佢帶住走咯。我覺得咁樣好似令到我好唔自由咯。咁所以我就一路喺度即係我會做 meditation 啊，會睇書啊，去 study 呢啲方面嘅嘢，點樣可以喺呢啲即係你所謂嘅精神空間入邊，可以得到嗰種自由咯，亦都從中呢啲都俾到好多畫畫嘅靈感我咯。所以我好多時有陣時啲作品你會見到個人好似一個空間咁，跟住會有啲人喺度走翻入去或者走翻出嚟，就係我喺度好似尋找緊一啲我想追求嘅自由啊，或者各方面嘅嘢咁樣，係。
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. The next question I have is, and many of you have already alluded to this, each of you work in different traditions of art making. For example, Pauline, you talked about felting, Joydeb does figurative painting, and Terrence figurative sculpture, and Lulu EB. I'm wondering, how do you engage with this, the historical tradition of the form, and how do you transform it in your own creative processes? Maybe I guess Joydeb, maybe you want to start.
আমি যখন কোনো কিছু মানে ড্রয়িংয়ের মধ্যে ড্রয়িং করি তখন কিন্তু মানে আমি কোনো ফিগারকে কল্পনা করি, আবার কিছু কিছু ফিগার হচ্ছে আমি ফেসবুক সোশ্যাল মিডিয়া ওইসব জায়গা থেকে নিয়ে থাকি, যেটা আমাদের বন্ধুরা হয়তো কোনো জায়গায় গ্রামে ঘুরতে গেছে, সেই জায়গায় কোনো একটা ছবি পেয়েছে, সেই ছবিগুলোকে আমি আমার মতো করে তাদের কাছ থেকে অনুমতি নিয়েই করি। কিন্তু আমি সবসময় আমার ছোটোবেলায় দেখে আসা মানে আমাদের মানে আদিবাসীরা যে অলংকারিক জিনিসগুলো পরে মানে সেগুলোকে আঁকার চেষ্টা করি।
I usually choose my figures from friends, from social media, and friends who have visited certain areas. Of course, I take their permission to use their pictures, and in my community, the women or the men who wear jewelry, traditional jewelry, I focus and enhance those jewelry in my tradition, in my work.
কারণ হচ্ছে মানে সময়ের সাথে সাথে মানে আমার যেমন আমার ভাই বোনেরা কিন্তু মানে আমার দাদা দাদিরা যে অলংকার পরে সেটা আর পরে না এখন, মানে সেটা খুব কম দেখা যায়, বাজারেও কিনতে পাওয়া যায় না। তো আমি আগে যেহেতু দেখছি মানে সেই দেখা থেকে আমি সেগুলোকে আঁকার চেষ্টা করি।
Over the years, the jewelry that my grandparents wore. My brothers and sisters don't wear them. It is slowly getting lost, and you cannot find them in the markets anymore. So I draw those from my memory, from what I saw as a child.
আর বেশিরভাগ আমরা কিন্তু মানে মানে আমাদের পাহাড়ি এলাকায় মানে বাঁশের বুনন এবং আমাদের নিজস্ব তাঁতের বুনন আছে সেই বুননগুলোকে দিয়ে হচ্ছে আমি ওই ফিগারগুলোকে মানে ওই টেক্সচার দিয়ে ফিল আপ করার চেষ্টা করি
In my community, there's the traditional weaving. We weave bamboo, we weave mats and baskets. It's a traditional style of weaving. I use those weaving patterns on the figurative bodies and figures in my drawings.
আর আমার বেশ কিছু কাজে হচ্ছে সিম্বল হিসেবে মানে আমি সেনাবাহিনীর একটা অবয়বকে মানে খুব ব্যবহার করি যেটা হচ্ছে গার্ড অব অনার মানে সর্বোচ্চ সম্মান জানানোতে কারণ হচ্ছে ছোটোবেলা থেকে মানে আমাদের গ্রামে মানে সবসময় আমি আর্মিদেরকে দেখেই বড় হয়েছি তো এই কারণে হয়তো মানে এটা অজান্তেই চলে আসে মানে
As a child, I have always seen the army guarding our areas, our community, in our local spaces. And I use the army in my drawings a lot as showing guard of honor. But sometimes that comes in a subconscious way. I don't think about it, but they just appear in my drawings.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, as for me, growing up in the family of sculpting, I understand that the first generation which I give thanks for, which they show us how to sculpt, in the 11th century, they record that Zimbabwe started doing the sculpting method. And the Zimbabwe itself is called Zimbabwe, which is the house of stones, according to the great Zimbabwe. So I took the understanding of the great Zimbabwe itself. So I took the method of sculpting, which is the traditional method of subtractive method of choosing a stone, and I make a head which resemble the first people who started sculpting. Then I make their characters, which I don't even know, which I feel like these characters, they are different in every time I make them. So I give respect to them, and I end up start to think of when do the sculpting and who decide to put records on the sculpting method. Then it gives me so much questions, and it gives me so much creation of how can I write my own history, how can I put myself into a certain world which I couldn't find. Then I end up having a chance to find materials which were made before the independence of Zimbabwe. Then I collected all those materials, like the likes of using the artillery shells, the likes of using the old letterbox tags, and the likes of the copper materials and the cables, which I couldn't understand how do they made these cables. Then I feel like the other curriculum which I see in this world which we are living, they are avoiding to say something where the minerals are coming from. To myself, I feel like there is a certain time when they tell the function of a certain material, but they don't tell the actual source of the mineral. So I end up recording the minerals, which are like the likes of copper, which is used as telephone cables. Then I found the telephone cables, then I put them as a costume, which resembled the channeling of our ancestors, as the symbolism again as a telephone, which we can communicate to each other from a different place to a different place. All those things I end up putting it together. Then I also try to find the history of conflict, which I couldn't managed to find in the written records. Then I found these artillery shows from 1940s, 1906, 1917. Then I put them into the record again. Then I make a head. Then I put them inside. Then I tried by all means to give respect to the people who fight for the Chimurenga, which is the liberation struggle of the Zimbabwe before they get independence. And I try to find balance again for the people who went and fight for the World War and try to respect these ancestors for us to be who we are. So all these components I end up finding in all places which I travel. I've been traveling for so many places. Sometimes I carry my stone from Zimbabwe because I just want my country and my culture, which is still surviving. And I use the black stone to resemble my black majority people, which we fought during that war. So I put it together. And sometimes I give it a resemble of names like Mukuru, which is the gods. I create my own gods, which blesses, which give knowledge to people, which pass through every certain generation, and which I feel like they should be resembled as a certain standing figure.
講繪畫傳統啦，咁我最初其實咧畫即係學 painting 嘅時候咧，係喺香港Hong Kong Art School 嗰度學嘅。咁好記得當時嘅老師都係另一位藝術家，叫做 Francis 余偉聯。咁佢係教傳統油畫啦。咁佢同我講咗一句説話咧，即係我當時係學油畫啦，但係佢話啊，你個人。即係佢望住我啲作品就話：你個人諗嘢都幾東方㗎喎咁。因為佢呢句説話咧，我就自己走咗去試畫水墨畫嘅。然後我就發覺咧啊，原來喺水墨畫嘅世界咧，我揾到好多樂趣咯。我好中意嗰啲好似好遊走嘅線條咯。咁於是乎咧我就想再去認識多啲。呢個傳統啦，即係水墨畫嘅傳統咧，我就去咗報咗一個 Hong Kong U Space 嘅中國水墨畫嘅課程啦。咁佢哋係需要睇 profile 咁樣啦。咁我就帶咗我啲水墨畫去啦。但係當時嘅老師咧就話：哇，你個人太西方啦，真係唔係好適合學水墨畫喎。佢話你諗清楚啲先啦，咁樣不如去學下啲興趣班玩下先咁樣咯。咁我當時就好 confused 啦。啊，點解即係西方嘅油畫又話我好東方，即係東方嘅水墨畫又話我好西方喎？咁後尾我就決定，咁我唔理啦，咁即係我自己畫啦，咁唯有。但係即係個心入邊都有少少唔忿氣嘅。咁我就於是乎咧，我就去咗學好多學咗好幾個中國哲學嘅課程咯。咁我就諗住，不如我用哲學嗰個位去切入去啦，咁咯。咁我其中一個我覺得，即係我學咁多課程入邊，其中一個我覺得好想分享下對我好大影響嘅咧，就係我當時學咗中國嘅易經啦。佢係一本好古老嘅教占卜嘅書嚟嘅。咁我學嘅課程咧，佢係講佢唔係講即係教你點樣占卜嘅，主要個老師主要係講義理嗰方面嘅，所以我係唔識得占卜嘅。但係佢亦都好簡單咁講咗咧，呢種古老嘅傳統嘅占卜方法咧，佢哋係會用50支嘅絲草去做一個占卜嘅。咁50咧呢個咧喺中國嚟講咧係叫做一個叫大顯之數啦。佢係代表咗天地萬物嘅。咁但係佢哋占卜嘅時候咧，就每次一定咧就會抽起一支擺喺側邊，就變成係用49支去占咯。佢話因為咧，如果50嘅話咧，即係個世界太完整太就定咗咧，就唔會有喐個感覺咯。所以咧占卜嘅時候一定用49咧，就係因為咧會有 有篤唔係，sorry 會有喐動嗰樣嘢咯。咁我就覺得哇，呢樣嘢好深深咁影響咗我嘅日後咯，因為我覺得呢個動嘅感覺，我好想帶喺我嘅繪畫入邊咯。咁所以咧，我學之後咧，我再畫嘅話咧，我都會不斷去思考點樣嗰幅畫唔係50而係49咯。想留翻有一種位係等到嗰幅畫係有一種動嘅感覺咯。咁所以係啦，即係所以我用咗個傳統就係唔係好技巧上嗰個咯，係咁同埋就於是乎我亦都即係我而家咧都有畫水墨啦，亦都有畫oil 嘅，咁但係我已經再冇理究竟 oil 嘅傳統要點樣一層層畫啦，水墨係要點樣畫咧，咁就冇理，我就用翻我自己嘅思想去表達咁樣，係。
So I thought your answer was very interesting, by the way. And so in my work, I obviously use felt making, which as I said before, I think a lot about memory, and I grew up between Asia and the U.S., and so I feel like a lot has been lost over just one generation. A lot of the traditions and a lot of my family's culture and stories. So when I was first learning about felt making, I found a lot of things that I thought were very interesting. Like felt is considered the world's first textile. There's all these origin stories. Including one that, Matthew, the shepherd, he was the one that created it. So there's all these origin stories, and I thought, translating it into this tapestry form, which historically has been used to hold stories about different places, about different cultures, was a way to kind of make solid all of these hazy memories that I had. So this is kind of like why I turned towards kind of tapestry making and working with this material. When I was also learning how to felt, I found that the process was very akin to kind of motherhood or nurture, because you go through this process where you have to very slowly and carefully lay out all the different fibers, and it's this process that's very additive. It's not it's unlike painting in that you have to build up. I mean, painting also you have to build up the layers, but with this one, it's like each fiber one by one you can place, and then in the end, you kind of go through this process of rubbing with hot soap and water, and it starts off very slow and very soft, and then it gets more and more physical and more kind of like angry almost. And so I thought it was kind of this funny parallel to raising a child or like bringing something up. Because you kind of start very softly and slowly, and then you kind of whip it into shape. So basically, the fibers all get knotted, and that's how it's made. So it's not really like woven. It's literally kind of like placed, and then it just forms. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I have one last question, and it's still being formulated as I'm speaking, so bear with me. I've noticed that there is an element of storytelling in all of your works, whether it's bearing witness to certain historical traumas, or it's kind of an index of a personal memory or index of a bodily experience, search for autonomy. And I'm curious about how, every artist has different ideas of what art is. And so I'm curious about, how does storytelling figure in your work, in your idea of what you're doing, and also how does that relate to perhaps legacy or transmission of intergenerational trauma or bearing witness. And whoever wants to start, you can begin.
Yeah, we just growing up, knowing some things which you didn't experience gives you so much like curiosity to want to understand these things. Like we should have time with the elders. So if the elders give us a certain information, we can have that thing. Because I always try by all means to question the history itself. Like why do we follow a certain written thing? Who write it? How do these people write it? Do they write it according to the plan which was supposed to be written, or they write it according to how they understand the things? As for me, I should supposed to live in two sides. I live in the history, and I live in the past, and I live in the present. So I really don't understand why we should follow the same channel. Then I end up going backwards to see how elderly people were supposed to live before even technology was being involved. Then I start to understand that there were so much things which they thought it was primitive. Like in Zimbabwe, there is a certain way of life which you should supposed to live. But if you don't live that life, when it comes again, it will comes in a consequence. Like we should respect the mother themselves, because the mother is like the heart of the family. And we as black people, we respect women because there are certain tradition or like ceremonies which happen into our place where you should suppose not to do without the women. The women should brew the beer, which is for the gods. So there is a certain time again where a certain material like grass, I took it as a female material, because in Zimbabwe people believe that the kitchen itself is made out of grass and it's made out of muddy and farm bricks. Then it belongs to the women. And if you want to renovate a certain kitchen like that, if it's your mother's kitchen or if it's your whoever wife's kitchen, you have to call a relative if someone is no longer there in future. Because if you just go and just take that grass and to renovate the place, the consequence won't face you, but will face the next generation. But those things we should supposed to follow. We don't know how these guys or the ancient people living and follow those things. And they will have time, when they think of time, they were using the sun itself. And if the sun is on this other angle, they know that the sun is on this other angle. So all those questions comes into my mind, and I have to make a certain figures which resemble those people with that knowledge, which I thought they were. Sometimes they thought it's extraterrestrial, people who lives with the time, but now they are not there. But now there is technology. But during that time, they were using a certain energy. And I use shiny stuff because I feel like I have to study the material itself. And I want to use like material because copper and another alu makes brass. Then I have to mix these two elements. Then it becomes a mixed media. So it's the same as using a stone, which is a mineral again, and using copper and using wire and using grass and using all these kind of elements, which are man-made elements and natural elements. So I'm trying by all means to connect these two energies from the past and the present. Then it becomes one. Then the next generation will learn from there, and they will upgrade the system, and they will make things better.
সত্যি বলতে কি মানে আমি যখন ছবি আঁকতে মানে কোনো কিছু পারফরমেন্স কিংবা ছবি আঁকার জন্য চিন্তা করি তখন আমি মানে যত মানে বিষয় থাকুক না কেন মানে মানে অতীতের ঘটে যাওয়া ঘটনা কিন্তু সেটা আমি মানে সমসাময়িক এখন আমি কি ভাবছি মানে সেটার উপরেই প্রাধান্য দিই
Whenever I perform or draw, of course it comes from what happened in the past, but I always prioritize what is happening right now.
অনেক ঘটনা আছে যেমন ভালো অনেক হচ্ছে খারাপ মানে খারাপ ঘটনা খারাপ স্মৃতি আছে ভালো ঘটনা ভালো স্মৃতি আছে সেইটাকে আমি মানে আমার মতো করেই মানে আঁকার চেষ্টা করি অন্যরা সেটাকে কে মানে যখন আঁকতে বসি আসলে তখন মানে আমি সম্পূর্ণ মানে আমাকেই প্রাধান্য দিই কোনটা আমি মানে আঁকবো কোনটা আমি আঁকবো না কি দেখাবো না এখন আগামীতে আমার কাজ নিয়ে অন্যরা কি ভাববে মানে সেটা নিয়েও কখনো আমি ভাবি না
Some drawings come out of good memories. Some drawings come out of bad memories. It really depends. And when I draw, I only think of what I am feeling of myself at that current time. I never think that what others will think of my drawings. I always prioritize my feelings.
এমন অনেক হয়েছে যে আমি হয়তো কোনো একটা প্রোগ্রামের জন্য আমন্ত্রিত হয়েছি একটা পারফরমেন্স করব তো আমি হয়তো 3 মাস ধরে সেটার জন্য প্রস্তুতি নিয়েছি অনেক ট্রোপস নিজে তৈরি করেছি কিন্তু যখন পারফরমেন্স চলে যায় তখন যে ওখানকার আবহাওয়াটা দেখি তখন আমি মানে ওই আগের পরিকল্পনাগুলোকে পুরো বাদ দিয়ে আমি নতুন একটা তাৎক্ষণিক কোনো কিছু ভাবি মানে এবং ওভাবেই পারফরমেন্স করছি
Sometimes when I am invited to perform, I think of the performance for months, sometimes even 3 months. I prepare for the performance. I make props, I make drawings for the performance, and I'm ready for the performance. But when I go in to perform, sometimes the situation is such and the current scenario, I immediately change because it is what I am feeling at that moment.
Thank you.
我畫畫嘅時候咧，應該話我畫嘅題材咧，其實好少有故事性嘅。但係即係我主要係畫嗰種情感啦，或者嗰個情緒啦。但係呢啲嘢佢背後當然係有嚟住某啲故事啦。亦都係唔開心多嘅，容易啲會記住嘅，係啦。透過畫畫咧，其實係好幫到去抒發呢樣嘢嘅。但係其實喺畫嘅時候咧，即係我試過喺一個好即係雖然我喺度畫情緒啦，但係喺真係最強烈嘅情緒嘅時候咧，我發覺咧係畫唔到畫嘅。我覺得即係尤其是我想要啲好準嘅線嘅話咧。嗰刻其實你係要需要某種專注同埋某種定啦。咁你如果情緒太強烈咧，其實你連揸嗰支筆咧，你隻手都可能其實係唔夠定咧，係做唔到嗰種我想要嘅線條或者效果咯。所以其實又好似冇故事喺後邊，但係其實又有啦。但係好似係喺度講緊某啲情緒啦，但係其實又需要有某種對於個情緒需要離開下，你要消化咗之後，再去呈現出嚟咯。咁喺情緒最強烈嘅時候咧，我反而係會寫低佢咯。咁而 寫低佢嘅時候咧，可以幫助去幫助去梳理翻嗰啲事情或者情緒之餘咧，你之後睇翻亦都可以成為一種創作嘅一啲靈感咯。咁同埋我亦都好多時係譬如尤其是畫大畫啦。我又會因為我中意畫一啲一筆過嘅線條啦。咁每畫一條線條咧，其實成個身咧都係喺度喐嘅。咁然後當你畫嘅時候咧，你就需要可能深呼吸得一啖，跟住咧你就要好肯定咁一筆就畫到去完咗，跟住你先至唞嗰啖氣咯。咁所以喺我自己覺得即係我好想帶出就係我嘅作品入邊好似想有一種呼吸嘅感覺咯。咁所以冇係咯，即係我又冇乜話要帶俾啲傳承啲乜嘢啦。不過好希望有嗰種呼吸咧，有嗰種動嗰種感覺咧，可以係同埋嗰種情緒咧，就係即係觀眾可以佢有多啲空間去自己都去想像啦，同埋佢哋我相信每個人都有某啲創傷或者某啲印記喺佢心入邊嘅。但係嗰啲嘢你好難，即係嗰種感覺咧，好難講出嚟俾人聽，或者係咯，好難用言語去表達嘅。咁如果佢都即係希望透過啲作品就係有某種大家可以互通到嘅某種情感，跟住佢睇完都覺得我好似都有一種有人明白我嘅感覺咁樣咯，係啦。
Repeat the question. So I think that storytelling figures quite a bit in each and every one of your works. I'm curious about how you think about art making as a method of bearing witness or indexing a kind of feeling or preserving personal memories.
So I already spoke a lot, I think, about kind of this topic, but in the piece, the large piece that I was working with, and also I have a sculptural practice too, a lot of those works I try to depict the memory, but not necessarily actual memory, but more maybe like the feeling of it. So kind of, I think of, I made these recent sculptures that resemble both a bedpost as well as like an old night lamppost. And I wanted them to evoke this feeling of nostalgia, but also almost like dreaming in your bed. And then on top of the bedpost were these scenes that held both personal memories, but then also depictions of kind of time. So there was a game of marbles on one, and then rocks on the bottom that kind of resembled like a Stonehenge or another archaeological site. And I like kind of those slippages between kind of large-scale time and very intimate moments. I think also like that idea of dreaming or like wish making is very prevalent in my work, because I like to think of it as this, as more of maybe like a spiritual way of belief versus, especially with the work with the MRI scans, maybe a more like scientific or hard way of believing, and how to balance these two spaces. I think then in my kind of more recent work, I've also been looking at the histories of ornamentation and design. Specifically, I go through archives from different large museum collections, so like the Met or the Albert Victoria Museum, and I look at their quote-unquote Asian art. And, you know, a lot of this art has been deemed as decorative or design, and I try and kind of call from that history as my source material and then recontextualize it. And so that's kind of taking these entire histories and trying to reorient them and place them in a more contemporary way. Yeah.
So I think perhaps it's time to open it up to the audience. If anyone wants to ask a question either to the entire panel or to a specific artist. Well,
1, 2. Okay, thank you guys for such an inspiring panel. My question's for Terrence. I'm just wondering, because you kind of highlighted how you tell stories from history, tradition, and then kind of bring them to the present. So I'm curious on how at least maybe your parents or the earlier generation responded to you kind of contemporarize some of the old ways of doing sculpture in a sense. So I'm trying to see if how they took that, and was it something like that? Saw it as progress, or they saw it as going in the wrong direction, and how people generally interpret your work back in Zimbabwe as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it's a good question. At first, it was very hard for me to have that kind of a decision, because growing up in a family of sculpting, which is more proper stone carving sculpting, and all the generations were sculpting stones, and the other masters start making sculptures like the likes of the Tapfuma Guta, who is one of our masters in mixed media, and Dominic Benura, which is one of the sculptor masters, which makes with fusing different kinds of stone. Yeah, it was very hard for my decision, because I thought it was art for the money before, because I grew up with the money for art. My father always doing this and selling sculptures. Then I thought of maybe and I went to the School of Visual Art Studios. Then I studied the African art itself, and I studied the history of art, how art Zimbabwe resembled the artworks in a different forms. Then I saw there is different forms of art in Zimbabwe. There is music, which is the mbira music, which is one of the most traditional music which we use by celebrating. During this time, it's another form of art. Then I went to the poems with people. Then I thought of it was another form of art. Then I thought of the house itself, how the mud house are being built, like Zimbabwe. Then I thought of what is the difference between me fusing all these elements. Can be poems into my sculptures, can be dressing into my sculptures, can be the designs and the patterns. Because of all the designs which we see in Zimbabwe, most of the designs and the chevron design, which is the zigzags design, came from the Great Zimbabwe, which is one of the biggest ruins. So it gives me a lot of confidence to just feel like I have to do this thing, because of this ruin is more than 11th century, which is more than 1,000 years old, but it's still surviving. It's a stone which is built without mortar. So what about a language which I can manage to manipulate and put it into practice? But it was very hard for the parents to accept it, because sometimes it was not successful, When you do it, you're expecting to do something, but if something doesn't come out of your pocket, when you do something, you end up give parents a hard time to help you, to give you confidence. But when time was going, when the ancestors want to open the doors, you can't stop them. They did what they're supposed to do. Then I found another material which I didn't think of, which I believe material came to me. Then I connected with the material. Then I make an artwork. Then something happened. Then I won a prize to go to Venice Biennale to see the Venice Biennale, which was my breakthrough. I went to Venice Biennale. They gave me $3,000 and said, go and build your studio. And I was like, I can't build my studio. I have to go and see the World Cup of Art. From then, the parents gave me a chance to say, like, okay, let us give him a chance. We don't have money at the house, but why can't we just give him a chance? From there, they gave me a door to just do what I thought it was the best for myself. So now, I think they are well satisfied by the language and by the ideas which I feel like I'm portraying to the world.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer as well. So just a quick follow-up as well. Zimbabwe tends to become more and more Christian country today. I think you kind of highlighted, you being inspired, talked about ancestral energy. You're evoking a lot about ancestors. In a country where most of the people probably see that as demonic in a sense. So I'm just curious on how the Zimbabwean public itself, especially among the Christians, whether in your family or elsewhere, how they interact with your work, and what kind of questions or conversation, get ignited after sort of, looking through your work as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because how I grew up determine how I'm supposed to be. Sometimes it's very complicated because we grew up as a traditional people. But, some people, they came with a certain influence, with a hidden agenda. So as they start to influence a certain knowledge to people, then that knowledge oppresses things. Then at the end of the day, we have things that we call taboos, things that we should not do, things that we say they are forbidden to do. Because of a certain language and a certain information which we are learning from, there's a certain book which they thought it's the holy book, which is the edited version of the living today, to my understanding. I have to create my own book and I have to create my own narrative, which is very hard. It seems like you are creating a certain system which you think that system is a good, or you have to follow the certain system. So it's very open to someone to think of how does a certain language means to someone. Sometimes it's takes a lot of studying, because I found a little bit of material which I thought they were silk. Then I studied them, then definitely they were silk. Then I studied the silkworm itself, and I thought that silkworm lives a long life, but the silkworm lives only for a month. It produces itself for a month, then after a month it dies. So I think knowledge itself, it's a little bit powerful if we give room for it. But if we think that what we know is what we know, I think it's a little bit tricky for the next generation.
I guess I can ask another question, or we can end this. Yeah. Okay. Maybe one last question from me. So I noticed that when you guys were talking about your creative processes, there were some moments where it felt like there was a kind of a moment of transcendence, especially, I guess, maybe Lulu, when you're talking about when you're painting, you actually have to, consciously block out a kind of, the tidal wave of emotional ups and downs, and kind of almost, be in a state of Zen. And Joydeb, you mentioned that, when you are performing, it almost feels like you're in an out-of-body experience. And perhaps, Pauline, when you're in the MRI machine, you are literally embodying a particular memory in order to index it onto the, machine. And Terrence, you mentioned the spirituality, the spiritual dimension, this oral tradition that has a spiritual dimension. So I'm curious, how does this sort of out of body or in the body or some sort of transcendental experience figure in your creative practice? Pauline, do you want to maybe begin?
I mean, I don't know if I actually have like a transcendence or moment, but I oftentimes when I'm making work, I will think about maybe a certain feeling or like a certain idea, and then I try and look for it and where I can find it across different areas or different mediums and how that can be translated. So with like the MRI scans, I'm taking it from a place of this site that is unseen, your memory, and then it's getting translated through this digital technological means and outputting a very technical image, and then by reworking it in felt, which is like a handmade process, I'm attempting to kind of redefine it again back into something that can literally be felt, not to make a pun, but yeah. So I think of I'm trying more kind of to find different avenues to get at maybe the same idea or the same arrival point. Yeah.
Joydeb, do you?
ব্যক্তিগতভাবে আমার জীবনটা হচ্ছে খুব ছোট একটা জায়গায় আবদ্ধ। আমি পাহাড়কে ভালোবাসি, আমাদের পাহাড়ের মানুষজনকে প্রতিদিন দেখি। তো আমি যদিও শহরে থাকি, কিন্তু প্রতি বন্ধের দিন 2 দিন বন্ধে কিন্তু আমি অবশ্যই কোনো গ্রামে যাই, অবশ্যই গ্রামে না গেলে কোনো পাহাড়ে যাই, কোনো জঙ্গলে যাই।
My experience comes from, or my inspiration comes from mountains. And I try to go to the mountains a lot in my area, in my community. I try to go to the village. Right now I live in the city, but I try to go to the village at least once or twice a week for inspiration.
তো আমার যখন কোথাও এইভাবে বের হই, তখন অনেকগুলো ঘটনা আমার মাথায় আসে, অনেকগুলো গল্প আমার কাছে আছে। হয়তো কোনো যে কোনো একজন মানুষের সাথে যখন বসে গল্প করি, সেই গল্পগুলো মাথায় রাখি। সেগুলো হচ্ছে আমি পরবর্তীতে যখন নিজের মতো করে একটু সাজাই, নিজের মধ্যে সেটা চিন্তা ভাবনাগুলো নিয়ে আসি। এভাবেই হচ্ছে পরবর্তীতে আমি সেটা ড্রয়িং অথবা পারফরমেন্সে নিয়ে যাব কি যাব না সেটা নিয়ে চিন্তা করি আসলে।
My work is inspired by stories of people. I meet a lot of people, I talk, and during our talks, I take back the memories, and later on I think about the conversation. Sometimes these conversations can evolve into my work, and so it really depends.
আমার এখনো অনেক কল্পনা পরিকল্পনা আছে মাথার মধ্যে, কিন্তু সেটা আগামীতে আসলে আর্টওয়ার্ক হিসেবে আসবে কি আসবে না সেটা আমি জানি না আসলে। ধন্যবাদ।
I think a lot, I dream a lot, and I don't know in the future if these will come into my works or not, but I dream a lot.
Lulu, do you want to?
我諗比起你話超越咧，我諗應該話係 透過畫畫係一個好好嘅一個出口咯，一個即係情緒抒發嘅一個好好嘅出口咯。咁然後係咯，我諗即係都幾幸福咯，可以做創作，因為如果唔係積壓唔知點算咁樣。咁同埋我諗你話禪嗰樣嘢，可能係其實譬如即係我覺得佢最幫到係即係一係打坐啦，或者 meditation 咧，因為嗰種內觀啦，去感受身體啦，呢個真係好有幫助去因為我經常做有一個叫做body scan 嘅一個練習啦，咁好幫到我去感受身體，慢慢好細好慢去觀察去掃描佢嘅時候，去攞翻嗰種感覺咧，好難用言語去形容啊，但係佢好可以幫我擺翻喺我嘅創作嗰度咯。咁係。
Yeah, thank you. My creation of these figurative sculptures reminds me of all these elders which I grew up with, but most of them, they've been like passed away. Like some of the information they give us like materials, like the small materials which they think they were souvenirs. So to myself, if I keep that souvenir then I feel like if I lose it, then it will haunt me. So I feel sometimes to put the souvenir in a piece of artwork. Then if that piece of artwork gets finished, then I feel that souvenir will live forever. This is the other method that I feel like I have to use in my sculptures. Then I have to study the stones itself, because the stones to me, they are so much energy to myself, because there are different kinds of stones which are sculpted in Zimbabwe. So this is the other inspiration which I feel. There are the stones which were first sculpted, which were the likes of the soapstone. Those stones, they are okay. I feel so comfortable to work with them, but they are not strong enough. Then there's a certain type of a generation in the stone sculptures which were using a different kind of stone, which was the serpentine, which was the green kind of serpentine. Then I feel like these stones, they have got a certain narratives in themselves. If I use those stones, I'm bringing the energy from that angle. So I have to channel and go to the mine and dig the stones on my own and put it in my truck, and I have to do it like physically. Then that process helps me to breathe and helps me to think. Then if I don't do that, I don't feel like I have done sculptures, because I have to go into the mine, I have to communicate with the people from the mine, which is the energy from the mine, the gods of the mine. Then they gave me the stones, and something better will come out of it. So that's another process which I feel. And there is another type of stones which nowadays people have been using. Like it started from the 1940s, when they rewrite the sculpting of Zimbabwe and they name it the Shona sculptures. Then that time I have to feel the stone again from that time. Then now they have stones which they are using machines. And now it's contemporary. It gives me another confidence of handling the tools which I couldn't have any chance to have. So I feel like I moved from the manual method of using stone carving and using the machines, which is like a little bit of a contemporary method of sculpting. But everything starts with the traditional method. So I feel like everything is a traditional thing. No matter we're going to use a certain material or a certain machine. So I feel that this is how I am.
Well, thank you guys so much, and thank you for listening. Okay, bye.